Hi everyone. Welcome to the March B List. My name is Rebecca. I'm part of the public programs team here at the State Library of New South Wales. I'd like to begin this evening by acknowledging that we're meeting for those of us who are on site on Gadigal land, the traditional custodians of this land on which knowledge has been exchanged for millennia. We celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal culture and language across New South Wales, and I take this opportunity to pay my respects to elders past, present, and especially emerging. Welcome to the first hybrid B-List event for 2022. We did it. For those of you sitting here, welcome back to the State Library, and I extend that welcome to everybody online who is joining us from wherever you may be. It's very exciting to finally be able to host the B-List in the way we had intended for the whole year. So thank you all for taking the time to join us. I'll shortly welcome to your screens Bri in conversation with Jane Caro, author of The Mother. The Mother is available for purchase through our State Library's online bookshop. The shop website can be found and accessed through the State Library's homepage of the website, and a quick mention that all purchases come with free delivery. For those of you on site, you would have seen we do have a stand at the back for any purchases this evening, and Jane will be available for signings at the conclusion of the talk. I'm going to hand over to Bri with a quick reminder that we are having a Q&A session, which Bri will moderate after her conversation with Jane. For all of you at home, we ask you to send through your questions on the Q&A section of the Zoom app, and Bri will moderate these questions. For those of you on site, Bri will repeat your questions into her microphone so the online audience will be able to hear those also. But that's all from me. Welcome, thank you, and I hand now over to Bri and Jane.
Thank you so much, Beck. And thank you to those of you who braved the weather, the horrific Sydney weather at the moment. And of course, COVID, the everlasting threat hanging over our heads. I'm really thrilled that we can come back together in person. If any of you remember the first year and a half, 2 years of doing B-List Book Club, it was glorious. But with thanks to Beck and Marcelo and the whole library team, we've been able to pivot, everyone's favorite word. And now it's thanks to their generosity and commitment that we might be able to have the best of both worlds, which is where people who are located nearby and can afford to can come and join us in person. But for accessibility, people can join for free from anywhere else online. And that is a testament to the incredible value and commitment of public libraries in Australia. So we are grateful for that. On behalf of Jane and myself, I would also like to acknowledge that we are gathering on what always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Here in Sydney, of course, that means beautiful Gadigal land in the Eora Nation. Sovereignty was never ceded and there has still been no treaty, and I support the Uluru Statement from the Heart. I am so excited. It's a book about heavy content, but it was fantastic. And I know what talking about those books is like. And I'm so thrilled to get to talk to you and talk to Jane tonight about The Mother. I absolutely tore through this book. It is a quintessential thriller with all of the good stuff that entails. But of course, it also just makes for perfect conversational content. So my pleasure to introduce formally Jane Caro, who is a Walkley Award-winning, AM, congratulations, who is a Walkley Award-winning Australian columnist, author, novelist, broadcaster, advertising writer, documentary maker, feminist, and social commentator. Jane appears frequently on Q&A, The Drum, and Sunrise. She has created and presented 5 documentary series for ABC's Compass, airing in 2015, 16, 17, 18, and 19. She and Catherine Fox present a popular podcast with Podcast One, Oz Stereo, Women with Clout. She writes regular columns in Sunday Life. She has published 12 books, including Just a Girl, Just a Queen, and Just Flesh and Blood, which is a young adult trilogy about the life of Elizabeth Tudor, and the memoir Plain Speaking Jane, which I would just like to briefly add here was the first time I ever saw you in real life when I was working at Avid Reader, the indie bookstore in Brisbane, on their events team, and gazing up starry-eyed. So it's good to be on the stage with you now. She created...
The only way anyone gazes up at me is if I am on a stage.
There is a line in this book where the protagonist laments about being short, and I thought, oh, ho, ho, ho. She created and edited Unbreakable, which features stories women writers had never told before and was published just before the Harvey Weinstein revelations. Her most recent non-fiction work is Accidental Feminists, about the fate of women over 50. And this book that we will be discussing tonight, The Mother, is her first novel for adults. Please give her a very warm welcome.
Thank you.
And just a reminder for those playing at home, you can type your questions into the Q&A box at any point in time while Jane and I are speaking. Okay, I want to start with a bunch of questions about what actually happens in the book. Miriam, who is our protagonist, refers to Ali as her fragile daughter. Can you introduce us to these women and tell us a bit about their relationship?
Yes, Miriam is at the beginning of the book in her late 50s, and I describe her quite a lot when I'm speaking about her as someone who's a little bit smug. She's a very privileged woman, and she kind of knows it, but she's also very pleased about it. And life has gone well. She's happily married and been married to a lovely guy for a really long time. She has a beautiful house, lovely garden. She's got a successful real estate business. She's a miner, kind of well-known face in her area because she puts her perfectly coiffed and made up head on all the for sale and sold signs around the neighbourhood. She has two daughters, both of whom are smart and successful. One's married and has a small daughter, so she has a grandchild she's delighted about. The other daughter has always been the daughter that Miriam has found harder to have a kind of easy and close relationship with. She has a very comfortable relationship with her oldest daughter, or at least she thinks she does. And about Ali, she worries, and she's always worried. Ever since she was a little kid, she's found Ali to be more unpredictable, more mercurial than Fiona, who's always been reliable, dependable, predictable. And she's said to herself, oh, well, Pete, her husband, he deals better with Ali, I deal better with Fiona, that works out fine. But she loves Ali. That lack of the easiness, it's not they're not close exactly, they just scratch at each other a bit. And Miriam feels that she has an uncanny ability to say exactly the wrong thing at the wrong time to her youngest daughter, particularly when she's trying very hard not to. And so there's this sort of friction between the two of them. But she's feeling particularly smug because Ali, after a succession of dropkick boyfriends, has, even though she's an economist and, you know, doing really well in her career, has finally brought home the suitor from Central Casting. He's tall, he's handsome, he's charming. He's got, I describe him as having JFK Jr. hair, which is seriously the best hair I've ever seen. You know, everything about him, he's very kind of solicitous to his mother-in-law, which of course means that she immediately warms to him. But there's a more important reason than that as to why she likes him so much. Well, he's a vet as well, practically a doctor. And there's another reason she warms to him, probably the most important one, he's going to take Ali off her hands.
That's the quote I have here. I'm so relieved Nick has taken her off my hands.
Yeah, she doesn't have to worry about fragile Ali anymore. That's Nick's problem. Isn't that great? But of course, he, you know, appears to adore Ali and she loves him back. And in fact, it's been a whirlwind romance. They've kind of met and then become inseparable really quickly. And they marry, and Miriam and Pete think, hallelujah, now both daughters married. It's a bit like Mrs. Bennet in Pride and Prejudice. You know, both daughters married with a decent income. Good, we can go off and enjoy ourselves.
In my family, the equivalent of that, I swear I could see it pass over my father's face when I, as the second and younger child, also graduated from university. And he sat there and it was just very clearly like, done. Finally, tick, job, parent, job done.
I don't blame Miriam for that feeling.
Mm.
I have had it myself and still do.
The other thing about Nick, I want to talk a little bit more about Nick and how great he is in Miriam's eyes, because it's a big deal. It's not just that he is a sort of strapping hunk who can provide. It's also that he cooks and he pays attention to Miriam and listens to her. It's not a, stereotypical like masculinity thing.
And he even keeps her irrational secret in that she gets him to help her hide Pete's, this is giving away the fact that Pete dies in the 3rd chapter, which is something that my husband finds difficult to cope with. I say to him, he was a plot device, he had to go. But he actually helps Miriam when she's absolutely half crazed with grief, to shove Nick's ashes, the ugly plastic urn that comes back from the funeral home, right at the back of the high cupboard in the linen, the linen cupboard, right at the back where she can't reach it because she's too little, she'd have to get a step ladder. And she almost shuts him away as far from her as she can. And she gets Nick offers to help her as she's trying to drag the ladder through the house. And he asks her why she's doing it. And she doesn't really say, or he doesn't ask her, and she's really grateful that he doesn't. She's really grateful that he just helps her and doesn't interfere. And then, as far as she can tell, never tells anyone about what she's done. So he even colludes with her in her grief and kind of irrational desire to take some sort of flimsy revenge on Pete for dying, but also trying to shut away the evidence that he's dead.
And she interprets that very much as emotional intelligence and insightfulness and supportiveness. But then in very quick succession, Ali's life changes. Describe what happens to her and her life change. I'm thinking of the move, the job, etc.
Well, basically, he's a vet. So he works with big animals. So they go to live in the country. Only 2.5 hours drive away. So, not the other side of the world. And very quickly, Ali gets pregnant, sort of unplanned. And Miriam, bereaved now, Pete has died. Pete has a massive aneurysm. So he goes off to work one morning and basically that's the last time she ever sees him. So it's a brutal kind of way to lose your long-term partner. And in her grief, she reaches out to Ali and wants to go and see her, and particularly after she has another grandchild, a grandson, she wants to be involved in this little boy's life. But there's always a reason why she can't come. There's always a reason why she, it's not convenient or not the right time. And Miriam is insecure about how Ali feels about her because she blames herself and feels that she hasn't been as good a mother as she could have been to Ali. And so she worries that when she rings Ali and Ali doesn't answer and it goes to voicemail, that her number comes up and Ali makes a decision not to pick up. So she projects this idea that Ali doesn't want to talk to her. And so she's sort of caught between wanting to push and terrified to push. And so she tries to give them the distance she thinks they need. But at the same time, she worries about why they need it.
And that also explains why, as she starts becoming concerned, even just for Ali's well-being as a new mother, Miriam is chatting to one of her colleagues at work, and the colleague says, well, they're only an hour away. Why don't you just drive? And Miriam is thinking to herself, I could just get in the car and drive, but she doesn't.
No, she's afraid that she'll be rejected. She's afraid that, Ali will roll her eyes and, say, oh, Mum, you don't need to, don't, that feeling you get sometimes that you're crushing someone, you're invading their space. Smothering or yeah. Don't get too involved. It's all fine. Everything's great. And so she's had that message so often from Ali that she's frightened to go. And also, she's grieving. And I think when you're grieving, it's really hard to take rejection because in a way, a death is a It is a rejection. And so there's that raw wound, really. And she doesn't want to risk anyone poking it.
I want to talk about one specific phone call. So Ali has given birth to her first child. It's been only a little while. And Miriam starts to notice changes in her daughter's behavior and attitude. And then Nick calls Miriam, which is very unusual in and of itself. And Nick basically says that Ali's going crazy. And Miriam believes him. Why does she respond like that?
I think it's because she's had all these questions in her head about why is Ali keeping me at arm's length? And she's also seen Ali kind of fall apart after the birth of Teddy. Now she's explained it away as the baby blues, you know, the 4-day baby blues, but it left a slight, oh, she's feeling very vulnerable. And she has a memory of a friend when she was a young mother who did get postpartum psychosis, and that's a fear of hers. And also somewhere in Miriam, there's always been a fear of going mad. Miriam likes to feel in control, and she's always feared losing control. And so I think in some ways she projects that onto her daughter. And also Nick is very plausible. He doesn't say, I think she's going crazy. He says, has Ali ever had any mental health issues? So he just does that undermine. And Miriam doesn't, she defends her daughter and refuses to say, no, what are you talking about? But she remembers when she was a mute teenager who wouldn't leave her room and, you know, was sullen and difficult. So even though she doesn't betray that confidence or that experience, it's still in her head. And so it's very cleverly done by Nick because it's very subtle. And of course, then Miriam finds out that Ali's seeing a psychiatrist. Psychiatrists are thin on the ground in country towns, so she ends up being visited regularly by the mental health nurse.
How does Miriam respond when one or two other people tell her that they just don't like Nick? There are a couple of people who see something that Miriam clearly doesn't.
Yeah.
And yeah, tell us about that.
Well, the first person who reveals that she doesn't like her brother-in-law is the elder daughter, Fiona, who says, I don't like him. And Miriam takes that to be sibling rivalry and jealousy, and she's a bit annoyed. And she says, well, your sister loves him, so keep it to yourself. You know, she's got enough to deal with. She doesn't need you not liking him. And she can't see it because he's very, very nice to Miriam. But Fiona says, he never looks at me. I never feel shorter or dumpier or plainer than when I'm with Nick. He never looks at me. And Miriam, that's not how he treats her. So she sees this as Fiona's issue. And the other person who doesn't like him, Miriam actually responds to very differently. And this is Jeremy, who is the only friend that Ali is able to make when they move to the country town. And he is a young gay man who sells a coffee. That's how they get to sort of be friends. And as we find out later in the book, I think Jeremy recognises very quickly what's going on. He's the first one, I think, who really does. And so they become close friends. And they go out for a drink one night, and Miriam and Jeremy get very pleasantly pissed together. And Nick, of course, the phone rings and Ali reacts to him calling her with real fear, I suppose.
This is when Nick has gone away on a conference,
a vets
and
conference.
So Miriam is visiting for the first time in ever or in a really long time?
I think in a really long time. I can't actually remember now whether it's, I think it is actually the first time that she's...
First time since the child has been born,
yes,
that's for sure.
She comes for the... to the Airbnb and stays at the Airbnb. And then she, and that all looks absolutely, the relationship looks really fantastic at that point. But at this point, she's actually staying in the house because Nick basically rings and says, I'm worried about leaving her on her own. Again, more of this, with the baby, house is a tip, she's out of control.
God, that house is a tip thing really shat me.
Yeah.
Yeah. But
Yeah.
also then Miriam says to him, well, if the house is a tip, maybe you can help out by cleaning up. And he goes, yeah, okay.
Yeah.
He never arcs up at her.
Not at that point, no. And so Jeremy basically calls Nick a name I won't say in the State Library. I have had a couple of people say, I really like the book except for all the swearing. I thought, gosh, what circles do you mix in? Obviously not the ones I do. And Miriam goes along with it. Actually, there's something in Miriam at this point where she's starting to wonder, and this is when she's staying the weekend, and she's starting to see how miserable Ali actually is. And although she's not come to any firm conclusions as to why that might be, she is starting to wonder if Nick is actually quite the husband that she thought he was. And Jeremy, the reason Jeremy doesn't like him is because of Jeremy's own family history, which comes out at a later time.
I want to ask you a bit now about the themes and the research with this book. Why turn to fiction to tell this story? You have written fiction before, but this is very much your first fiction for adults. And you have a very strong and well-established platform in various, I would say, kinds of nonfiction. And the issues this book explores, a lot of people, myself included, I would presume that if I wanted to look into these issues, it would be through nonfiction. Can you talk a bit about, I guess, the genesis of this project and why you wanted it to be a novel?
Well, the first is that that's the way the idea presented itself to me as a fictional idea, because it was inspired by a photograph I saw of a woman and her children who were the victims of those awful headlines that we just see. I've seen another one only a week ago, and often we see photos of them for a few days while the story is going through the media. And this is a particular photo, it wasn't particularly dramatic, of her and the children, and with them was an older woman, not her mother, maybe her grandmother, and her face was pixelated. And I just looked at this photo of the older woman and I thought, how must she be feeling now? How must she, what would she be thinking about her own relationship? And, just all the things that must go through your mind when you have something like that happen in your family.
All the people it's almost like the ripple effect. All the people in the next line of the ripples. It's not necessarily what we would call the complainant or the defendant, but it's that next ring of
And I was looking at this older woman and I thought, what if it was me? What if it was my daughter and she was married to someone who turned out to be a monster? What if it was my grandchildren? I've got 2 grandchildren who are under threat. How would I feel? What would I do? And then I thought, well, I know what I'd want to do. And that was where the sort of genesis of the idea came. And at first I wondered a number of things. I thought, is this a suitable subject for a novel, or is it exploitative? Because not my lived experience, this kind of coercive control and abuse. So the first thing I did was go and talk to people in the sector, particularly Annabelle Daniel, who runs Community Women's Shelter. And she was incredibly enthusiastic and said, yes, a novel is really important because it'll reach people in a different way. And also it opens it up to a new audience. So people who might not read a non-fiction book about domestic violence and abuse might read a thriller. And so that made me think, okay, so I can continue to develop this idea. And I realised too, that when you're in fiction, when you're writing fiction, there are a number of things that are really important about fiction. The first is I'm writing about people I've made up. This is not a real person's life. Now, it may resonate with people who have lived through similar experiences, but I still, as these are fictional characters, you have a freedom to explore and to be inside their head and to interpret and to give them thoughts and actions that you can't do when you're writing about someone's real life. So there's a freedom in fiction that is very liberating, and I think is the fun of writing it. And sometimes I think it's probably the fun of reading it as well. But there's also the thing that fiction, when you write non-fiction, of course you want to move people and you want to get them involved and engaged, but often what you want to do is make them angry. Because what you're really trying to do is get them to get active, and, you know, you're persuading them to a point of view and you want them to get active.
The ultimate compliment of books is when somebody says, oh, I read your book and it made me so angry. And you're like, yes,
Yes.
yes, job done.
Well, this book, I didn't want to make you angry. I wanted to make you feel what Miriam and Alison feel. I wanted you to feel the fear. I wanted you to feel the bewilderment. I wanted you to feel the dread. I wanted you to struggle with the dilemmas. I wanted you to gasp and, you know, actually vicariously, which is what fiction does. It gets you out of your head and it gets you into your gut and your heart, and it gets you to, I think of fiction, it's not time travel, though it can be if it's an historical novel, but it's people travel. It's like you take a period of time and you actually live someone else's life. And by doing that, it takes you out of judgment and into compassion. Because what we hear a lot around women who've suffered and survived domestic violence, coercive control, why didn't she leave? Well, I would never have married a man like that. Why couldn't she see through him? And worst of all, well, she should have let him see his children. Judgment, judgment, judgment. And what that does is, of course, it shuts survivors up, makes them feel ashamed. It does the opposite of what you want. So, you know, if you want to change this, we're going to need to hear these stories. And I felt that in a way, people reading fiction about this, because they go through, it opens up their compassion rather than their judgment. I hoped it would help open people's minds a bit more. And also for all the very many women who have lived experience of this kind of thing. I think there's something that is where when you have a novel written about your situation, there's a compliment being paid, there's an attention being paid. Your story is important enough to be in a novel, to be centred in a novel, to be told and taken seriously and validated in that way. Because if it's an imaginary story, it can be your story. If it's a factual story, even if you identify with it, it's that person's real story. Fiction we can all own.
You mentioned one of the people you spoke to. I'm interested to hear a bit more about the research process and how long it took, because you're a very well-informed woman. You speak publicly about issues relating to women and gender. What were the things that challenged even your knowledge or preconceptions about these issues?
Oh, lots of things. I was very lucky in that, I suppose because I have been kind of involved in some way in this sector and advocating and things for a long time, I got a lot of help. So me, this is fantastic. She said, I'm going to send you a judgment. And it was the summing up of a murder case where, and it was a murder case where a man had thrown his girlfriend off a high-rise balcony. And she said to me, this judge's summing up is the best description of coercive control I have ever read. And so that was an absolute gift to get that kind of very clearly explained drip, 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 drip of how it builds up. And so that was really helpful. I also read widely, obviously. I mean, Jess Hill's book, See What You Made Me Do, was just also an invaluable resource. And articles, I mean, I don't know, I remember when I was pregnant, everywhere I looked, there were pregnant women. I
just want to let people know, if anyone's watching at home, it was the judgment of Simon Gittany, convicted of the horrifying murder of his partner, Lisa Harnham, in 2013.
Yeah.
Sorry.
That's all right. Yes, I just noticed that when you're pregnant, you see pregnant women everywhere. When you're researching a book about domestic violence, there's like articles and, you know, they almost seem to pop out of the woodwork. So there was a lot of good material to draw on. And I was lucky in that I had some friends, a judge friend of mine went through the courtroom chapter and, you know, corrected any of my foolish inaccuracies and things like that. I talked to the police. I think they're a bit sick of novelists asking them about police procedure, but they were very kind. But the moment that really challenged me, technically, it's so interesting writing a novel about something as serious and as dark as this, because yes, it is disturbing, and yes, it does get to you as well. But you're a novelist. You're technically engaged in the process of making this story work. And for us to...
your altruistic purpose will not succeed unless your craft purpose succeeds.
Yeah. And so there is a distance that you maintain. I keep thinking it's like a therapist who can't afford to get too emotionally engaged in what their patients are telling them, because then there won't be any use to them as a therapist. So you do have that professional distance that you have to have. And so technically, to carry the reader along with Miriam and hold on to their sympathy, I have to ramp up the threat. And so that's what I tried to do. And I went to some very dark and I thought extreme places to ramp up that threat. And at one point I doubted myself. I thought, no, I've gone too far. This is ridiculous. No, this would never happen. This is just, no, jump the shark. And I wrote to a friend of mine, I sent an email to a friend of mine who is, we went to primary school together, but he's now one of Australia's top family lawyers. And I said to him, look, have I gone too far? I jumped the shark here. And he came back to me and he said, nope, you've just summarised half the files on my desk. Now, from the technical novelist's point of view, that's comforting. Good, you can keep that in. But from the human being's point of view, that's devastating. That means me thinking I've gone way over the top here. No, this, not only have I not gone over the top, but this is what much more common than I think even those of us who want to know more about this space have really accepted.
This is perfect timing. I wanted to ask a question about the thriller genre, and I'm not quite sure how to word it, but I'm confident you'll understand what I mean. Because as I was reading your book, I was thinking about our growing understanding of the concept and very real issue of coercive control, and how very terrifying and how destabilizing it is. And I know Jess Hill talks about these perpetrators basically playing by a playbook, and that it's, and I was thinking about the thriller genre, and I couldn't help but wonder why such, to be frank, such sort of perfect material for the thriller genre is not, and how common the issue of coercive control is. Why do you think it's not the case that every second thriller that is published has at least some facet of coercive control, which we know presents in many different types of relationships?
Interestingly, I think there has been things about coercive control, but it's not been identified as such. So even if you think of the legend, the story of Bluebeard, you know, that in a way is coercive control. If you think of the old film, which was from a play, I think, Gaslighting, it is about coercive control, but we didn't have a name for it.
Or a framework.
Or a framework, exactly. So these were just out-of-the-box thriller stories that fitted in with spy thrillers or serial killer thrillers. We didn't think about this as particularly gendered, and we didn't think about it as being a kind of syndrome, like a framework, a common occurrence. I mean, I keep recommending that people go back, if they haven't read, I mean, the least famous of the Bronte sisters, Anne Bronte, wrote an absolutely textbook example of coercive control called The Tenant of Wildfell Hall. Yeah, in about 1820. So, and she had been a governess, and I'm sure she must have witnessed something like this while she was a governess in probably a house that she's modelled Wildfell Hall on. So women have, and some men have been writing about this kind of behaviour, but we didn't identify it as a thing. We just thought of it as an imaginary tale. I think the reason that, and there's books now coming out more and more. I mean, Deborah Oswald's The Family Doctor is very much about, sort of more about domestic violence than it is about coercive control, perhaps. And I think Michael Robotham has written about it as well. So it is starting to become a thing. But I think it's like so many things with humans, until we can put a name to it, we can't quite accept it exists.
And I feel that it's not until we get to a point where it is in the mainstream, until we get to a point where the like sort of pop culture equilibrium has accepted it, that a thriller by, you know, a best-selling paperback page turner, or a new one in every 3 new sort of dramatic Netflix series or whatever, until we're at the stage where every person growing up knows what coercive control is because it's in the pop culture, we're never going to actually get to the stage where we can talk about it comfortably in public.
And where we can say to someone, watch out, this disturbs me when your boyfriend does that, because it's still described as love. That obsessive jealousy, he doesn't like me going out with my friend, is still seen as proof of some kind of love. It's, of course it's not, but we haven't got to that point yet in our understanding of it. And I think it's because it is gendered. And so we don't like centering women's experiences. And coercive control is about doing that.
How does this book fit in with your, like the recent announcement you've made about your political career? Tell us a bit about that. Was it sort of always the plan to have those simultaneous? No? Okay. From the top.
As someone said to me, Jane, you would have to be unbelievably amazing to be able to write a novel with the full knowledge that you were going to be running a political campaign at the same time, or decide to run a political campaign at the same time as you were launching a novel. No, these two things happened completely coincidentally at the same time. I mean, in a way, COVID drove me to actually put, well, not pen to paper, finger to keyboard, because what else are you going to do? I had this idea, I had a literary agent, I got a publisher, I may as well write it. So I wrote it. Scott Morrison decides when the election is, so there was nothing I could do about that. He still appears not to have decided. But it has worked out well in one way, in that we're very small fry, the reason Australia and me standing for the Senate, and we could never have created all the opportunities for me to get out and about and talk to people and meet people and travel around on the amount of money and the amount of volunteers that we have. So that's been wonderful. On the other side of the ledger, I am buggered. I hardly stop at the moment, but that's okay. It's really enjoyable and it's very exciting. Are they related? Yes, they are in a way. They come from the same spring, I think, or trigger, which is, I'm 65 in June. I've been talking about feminism, women's rights, trying to be a voice for the people I think that get the least amount of attention for as long as I can remember. And I feel like it's getting urgent. I'm really pleased on one level that we are able to have thrillers about coercive control, that women are throwing, and I think it's post Me Too actually, throwing off the shame that they used to hold. So a woman who was the victim of a coercive control often, and still does, feels ashamed. They also do start to believe that they're crazy because it's all about undermining their sense of reality. But I think when we tell these stories and people can recognise what's happened to them, they can take that shame, which doesn't belong to them, and put it where it does belong, which is on the person who decided to use their power to destroy someone else or to take advantage of someone else. The shame always belongs to the person who makes that decision, not the person who is abused. And so I think for the first time in history, women have refused to hold on to that shame anymore. And what that has done is it's liberated voices. People can speak. When they're ashamed, they can't speak, because to speak it is to voice your, is to risk rejection and all the things Miriam, in a very small way, was afraid of having happen to her. And so that's really, really changed. And I think that's a huge and revolutionary change. I actually think it's a tectonic shift. We're only at the very beginning of it. But in other ways, and perhaps not coincidentally, we see a reactionary reaction, where there is a desperate attempt to put women back in their box, to shut everything back down, to return to an old patriarchal, Christian, almost quasi-theocratic way of approaching leadership, government, all that kind of thing. Anything this government does for women, they are dragged kicking and screaming to the sticking point before they will do it. They almost seem to treat women the same way they treat climate change, as an inconvenience.
Preferably don't exist.
Yeah, preferably don't exist. Not like they exist. You know, we're not human really, sort of quasi-human. And so I have become totally frustrated with, first and foremost, our action or lack thereof on climate change. I mean, as I said before, I'm a grandmother. I look at my grandchildren who are 6 and 4, who will be by 2060, when they're now saying, if we don't do something like now, there will not be a livable planet in 2060. They will be in their 40s. And I look at them and I'm mortified that I will not be leaving them a world in as good a shape as my grandparents left to me. That, I think, is a profound generational failure. And I just felt, well, I've got to do something. What can I do? Yes, this novel is a part of it, a part of that same wellspring, if you like. But running for office, I got asked. Reason Australia rang me and asked me. And I thought, okay, if not, Zoe Daniel says it really well. She's standing as an independent in Goldstein against Tim Wilson. Gosh, I hope she wins. She says, if not me, who? If not now, when? And that's exactly what I felt. And obviously I'm not alone in that, because the defining characteristic of this election is the number of women. Predominantly, there are some men who are standing as independents too, but the vast majority are women who are standing up and saying, no, we have to change this country's direction. It's disastrous. And I think women speaking up about domestic violence, about coercive control, about, you know, the truth of women's lived experiences, the fact that women's pain is not paid attention to. You know, I still find it impossible to believe that after about 300 years of digging up graves and taking out bodies so that medical students could cut them up and examine them, and this was against the law and at high risk, it was only a couple of years ago that anyone worked out how big the clitoris was. What the hell did those grave diggers think this thing was in women's bodies? Or did they just sort of toss it aside? There's a bit of wasted God knows what. I just can't believe it. It's like, I'm 65 and I've always known that sexism was bad, but it's only been in the last few years that I've realised how bad, how blind we have been to the lived experience of half the human race. And I guess I feel like I'm running out of time. So if I'm going to do it, I better do it.
I have a few more questions for Jane, and then we will go to audience questions. A couple of people have sent through some already online. Thank you. Please keep doing so. I want to bring it back to the book. I'm not giving away any real spoilers, but the book is split into 2 parts. At the end of part 1, Ali has tried to leave Nick. There is a confrontation. Miriam is full of fear, yes, but also she's full of a sort of I would describe like sort of optimistic determination about protecting her daughter, keeping Nick away, etc. That's at the end of part 1. And then there's a gap of 4 years between parts 1 and 2. Talk to us about what happens in those 4 years and why you split the book in that way.
In those 4 years, Miriam's illusions about how the world works are shattered. Because at the end of part 1, remember, she's a privileged white woman. She really believes
Call
that
the cops and everything will be
feel
okay.
Yeah. You get the AVO and it's like waving garlic at a vampire. The bad guy will go away. The justice system will work. It's perfectly clear, who's in the right and who's in the wrong. So we'll just fix it. She'll get a divorce. Okay, I'm convinced now. He's a dickhead. She'll get a divorce. They'll move on with their lives. And that turns out to be, no, completely illusory. And in those 4 years, Miriam has had to completely change the way she lives her life and spend a lot of money on things like elaborate security devices. She's had to learn just how impossible it is to deal with someone who is not rational, whose obsession is so all-encompassing that they will do anything, whose narcissism, because the thing about Nick is he is a narcissist, is that his narcissism is so overpowering that he can turn the charm on at the right time. The very things that convinced her he was so plausible and so work to convince a whole lot of other people in just the same way. And she has become increasingly aware that there is no end to this except tragedy. And she starts to think about what kind of a tragedy she wants it to be. She knows it will be a tragedy, but what kind of a tragedy? Whose tragedy she wants it to be? And that's what has happened in those 4 years.
One of the questions I had for you is also very similar to one that we've received online from Linda. Linda wants to know why the mum, Miriam, is so reluctant to believe her daughter, Ali. My question, which is sort of similar, is that the way Miriam responds when Ali turns up at her door, so this is when she's just finally tried to make a break from Nick and she has the kids with her, Miriam responds, like the way Miriam responds was extremely uncomfortable to read. So the sort of caseworker, mental health?
Mental health nurse, yeah.
Mental health nurse, who was Ali's mental health nurse, calls Miriam and says, your daughter is on the way, get ready to receive her. And Miriam says about Ali, she can be very dramatic and she hasn't been well for a long time, which is excruciating to read. And then even when Ali arrives at the home that night and Ali is sort of describing the horrors to Miriam. Miriam says, I didn't know you were thinking of leaving him, as though it was just a regular divorce or like a falling out that Ali needed to justify. Why did you write it like that? Why was it important to show how sort of poorly or ineffectively Miriam was adjusting to this information?
Because I think Miriam, to some extent, is us. The reason I tell it from the perspective of someone who is watching this unfold and dragged into it unwillingly. At one point she says, this is not, I didn't cause this. I didn't pick him. I'm having to live with all of this. And I think that's human. I'm not blaming Miriam for having complex and sometimes selfish responses. That's how human beings are. That's how we all are. But Miriam is us. She is observing rather than experiencing. She does eventually experience, but not like her daughter does. And we resist believing. And partly that's completely understandable. No one wants to believe that that sort of thing can happen. And also, I wanted to represent how much more easily we find it to say, she must be mad, than he is insane. And Miriam is a product of her time and her society. And as Elizabeth Broderick once said, sexism is like asbestos in the walls. We breathe it in. None of us are free of it. Miriam's not free of it. And so she responds in a sexist way. And also it's a terrible, like, in her defense, Ali has invested a lot of time and energy in pretending everything is okay. And so Miriam has believed that everything is okay. So she suddenly turns around and says, no, it's not okay at all. It's terrible. And Miriam's kind of like, what the? You've been keeping me at arm's length and telling me that everything's okay, and now it's not. So it's also that when you pretend everything's all right when it isn't, that also sets up barriers that you then have to overcome. So I'm trying to be as realistic. And I don't think there are any heroes. We're all stuffed up, and we all would prefer to believe the easy lie than face the hard truth.
Thank you. Do we have any questions from the audience here? And a reminder that I will be repeating them into the microphone. Yes, please. So the question was about Miriam's, which is also a question I had. Great question. Miriam's changing, I guess, conceptualization of her relationships, in particular with Pete, and also her changing attitude towards men. And in particular, I guess how, as she receives more information about Ali's situation, it causes her to ask questions that she'd not previously asked about her own marriage.
Yeah, I think there is a tendency to idealize our relationships. And Miriam and Pete have found a way to get on pretty well. But in fact, Miriam has been cosseted. One of the reasons she's a bit smug at the beginning is because Pete has protected her from a lot of the, difficulties of life. And she's allowed that to happen. Feels good. It's nice. So when he dies, one of the reasons it's so devastating is she's lost this protector between her and the world. Now, I'm not condemning either Pete or Miriam for that. I think that's pretty normal and natural in long-term relationships. But it's not entirely healthy either, and it can be limiting. And Miriam then, as often happens when someone loses a loved one, she idealizes Pete completely. He becomes almost a non-person in his, larger than life. Yet she also worries occasionally whether he might have found a better, more sensible solution than she did, which is also idealizing him, of course. But she sees him as sitting in judgment on her, in her mind, about what she does and doesn't do. So she's still got him in a way on a kind of a pedestal. And it is her next door neighbour, Julie, who in many ways is a pain in the ass, but occasionally she's a truth teller who says, yeah, but he used to protect you an awful lot. And maybe that's why Ali was attracted to Nick, because he's very protective too. And the trouble is that can be a bit controlling.
But let's go into this more properly. It's not a line between protective and controlling. It's a very big overlap.
Exactly. I think those edges are entirely blurred, and that what we sometimes confuse as protecting is in fact controlling. And like everything else, nothing is completely terrible or completely wonderful. Everything is a little bit If it's healthy and ordinary, it's a little bit of this and that. It's when it goes to being, you know, really extreme that it becomes toxic and unhealthy.
I just find it so strange because, you know, like there's this huge overlap between protective and controlling. But then I also feel like there's some kind of analogy here where so much of our society and the way we accept the norm of relationships being marriage is about two people to the exclusion of all others. And yet jealousy is a huge red flag. So there's also this huge sort of gray zone there where you for the marriage contract allegedly to work, you need to be jealous or upset if your partner transgresses, and yet we do not accept jealousy when it becomes controlling.
Yeah, I don't know. I've been married for 46 years. I'm not jealous, he's not jealous. So I think it doesn't have to be like that. And those are the negotiations that couples make. And I think that Miriam and Pete had worked out their negotiation reasonably well. It's never perfect. It's always reasonably well. And that's probably like friendship or sibling relationships, or think of Miriam and Alison, mother and child relationships. It's always reasonably well. Never perfect, always with slight bits of toxicity. There's always that. We're all fucked up. What did Philip Larkin say? They fuck you up, your mum and dad. They don't mean to, but they do. And I think that's true. They fuck you up, your husband and your wife. They don't mean to, but they do.
Garner says that writing is like parenting and that neither can be done without causing damage.
Yes, exactly right. And same with a long-lasting partnership. There is always compromises and diminishments, as well as sometimes the opposite. It's all mixed in there. And I was at pains to try to portray the complexity of real relationships to the extent when they become utterly, utterly toxic and terrible, but also when they're operating reasonably well, because there's still the same shit in there. It's just managed better. Pete is not perfect, but Pete and Miriam did love each other. And by the end of the book, Miriam has come to a place of accepting Pete as he was alive and the fact that he is now dead. And I think that was where I felt I needed to resolve her. Well, Miriam grows up after Pete dies. And it has been my experience of watching, particularly among the generations of women for whom marriage was destiny, that was the only choice they had. When their husbands do die, it's often a time, even if it's a short time, where women grow up.
There's a really great question from Anne that has come through, but in my opinion, it includes a spoiler. So Anne, I'm not going to ask that question, but I recognize that it is a good question. Do we have one more from our, yes, please, and stripes at the back, and then blue, yep. Great question. The questioner brings up a book she recently read by Tom Keneally called Corporal Hitler's Pistol, which surprisingly enough, I didn't know this because I saw the title and presumed it was not a subject matter I would be interested in. But a woman in the 30s and 40s is in what we would now, I suppose, describe as some kind of degree of controlling or coercive controlling relationship, and couldn't leave because of the structures in place, basically. And the question was, how far have we really come?
It's a really good question. I actually think if you look back pre-1960, even maybe pre-1980, even maybe pre-2017, what you see is a coercive controlling relationship between men and women, gender-wide. If you think about the kind of legal difficulties, I can remember as a child when I managed to skive off school by pretending I had a tummy ache and being allowed to watch daytime television on the couch, some of my happiest memories. There was a fabulous show called Divorce Court, which was dramatisations of someone about my vintage is nodding vigorously. It was introduced by Ron Hadrick, and it was dramatisations of actual stories of cases that came before the divorce court, as it then was. And in those days, it was fault. You had to prove fault before you were allowed to divorce. And so it was adultery, and it was, all these kinds of things. And the way that often the women were painted was very sexist, and they were transgressive. And the shame of divorce, and I remember there was a whole class of women when I was young called deserted wives. And everybody felt sorry for them, but no one ever had them over. And so the shame of the failure of a marriage resided with the woman, even if she was the woman who occasionally walked into a door, as it was often explained. And so there was an acceptance that women owed a duty to the man in their lives, no matter what kind of a man he was or the way he behaved to her. And the coercive control was really the secrecy and the fact that it was never to be spoken of, and that everything was set up to make it really difficult for a woman to leave her husband. But it's still really difficult for a woman to leave her husband. We've just seen a budget where nothing has been done to increase women's ability to earn an income. Things like having the fourth most expensive childcare system in the world is an extremely effective way of making women dependent on men. Accidental feminist is really all about that. It's about how we've set up the norms, the way we pay women so little for their work if they're in the caring professions, or they're casual and part-time because they've got to juggle caring duties with earning an income, how this means that then they have to, if they decide to leave, just a lousy, common garden variety lousy marriage or an abusive marriage, they have to look at things like, how will I afford a house? How will I get an income? How will I get a job? Superannuation, of which they have none. So we've basically created a coercive controlling relationship of men over women. Even men who don't want to be involved in that are the beneficiaries of centuries-old coercive control. The fact that conjugal rights existed until the 1980s is quite shocking, because that basically meant that the husband bought his wife's body with board and lodging.
A piece I wrote years ago for the research, I found that so this would have been in 2017, the then Queensland Police Commissioner started his job at a time where men were still entitled to the bodies of their wives in Queensland law.
Yeah.
That was like that we're still, I think for sort of women of my generation, there are some things that seem to us so obvious and such no-brainers, and it can be easy to forget that the people who still hold these positions of power and have huge effects on the sort of tone and culture of an entire system, let alone a workplace, let alone a family household, came up steeped in this, what they're breathing in, the asbestos.
We were, as young girls in the 70s, we were kind of frightened of a thing called being charged with being in moral danger. And what that meant was you'd had sex. And you could be taken to a girls' home. Your parents could say that you were in moral danger. They didn't like your boyfriend. That's what those Magdalene laundries and things were about in Ireland. They were there until, I think, the 1990s. And certainly in the 70s, in moral danger was an actual charge which could be put against a 14 or 15 or 16-year-old girl.
I do want to make sure we have time for one more. There's one more question from the audience over here. Thank you.
Mm. Yes, you are exactly right.
Jane, I'll let you repeat that question in your answer to that
question.
Because
I'm so exercised by this. This Chris Rock, Will Smith, two idiotic, egotistical, narcissistic men acting out stupid roles and behaving, both of them equally badly. I mean, Chris Rock's joke was appalling and Will Smith's behaviour was worse, but they're both idiots. And everyone's got an opinion about the men's behaviour, but I'm sorry, where the hell does Will Smith get off pretending to be a knight in shining armour when it's his wife who is insulted? And you know what? She is not his possession. She is an adult human being. She is a highly effective, highly articulate, powerful woman in her own right. If she had an issue with Chris Rock's joke, let her take care of it. Let her respond. It is not up to the husband to march up as if he owns her. And he said, don't you have my wife's name in your mouth. That is a declaration of ownership of territory. I own her. And our Prime Minister has come out and said, oh, he can understand Will's. He feels very protective towards Jenny on occasions. Well, not when he throws her under the bus for every time he's criticised for anything he doesn't. I seem to notice how very convenient Jenny appears to be for our current Prime Minister. Protecting her when it suits him, throwing her under the bus when it suits him. What a strange piece of behaviour, coercive control. I'm so angry because Jada Pinkett Smith has been disappeared in this fight between these two men. And yet it is her who is insulted. Her agency, her individuality, her ability to stand up for herself, all taken away.
We are out of time. Please join me in giving a huge, grateful round of applause to Jane for joining us tonight.
Thank you. And if you can be bothered, do get on the Jane Caro for Reason website. We need all the help we can get. And I would really like to get into the Senate and take it up to those superannuated private school boys every chance I get.
Great. We'll finish on that. Thank you.